Thank you very much to all of you for coming here, and thank you very much, Summer, for that nice introduction. It's very nice to be here in Asheville. Actually, I've never been before to North Carolina, so it's very nice. And the weather is much better than in New Jersey, I have to admit. So as to Martin Luther, what I saw here in the United States, I say just that you will not get the wrong impression. Lutheranism in the United States is apparently something else than Lutheranism in Luther's original region, which is Erfurt, which is Wittenberg, which is Leipzig. But Luther was, among many other things, also the first who installed in his University of Wittenberg, a chair for Hebrew, which is less known. In 1518, the first chair of Hebrew was founded in Luther's university by Luther himself. As far as we know, Luther didn't deal with the Samaritans, but at that time, then there were very few sources about the Samaritans in Europe. So who are the Samaritans? In terms of history and religion, the Samaritans are an Israelite sect. So they are not Jews, but they are, as the Jews, a sect of the Israelite tradition. And they regard themselves as descendants of the Israelite tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, and Levi. Ephraim and Manasseh, this is very interesting because Ephraim and Manasseh, according to the description in the Bible, were living just in the region of the tribes of Joseph, which is the region of Samaria. So this fits in terms of geography. Benjamin is just to the south, so very close, and Levi is, of course, the priestly tribe, which leads to the next point. So the Samaritans have priests. They have a priestly family, a priestly tribe. These priests regard themselves as descendants of the biblical Aaron, brother of Moses, and they still have the institution of a high priest, which, as you may know, also in the Jewish religion in Jerusalem, there was the institution of a high priest who was the first and foremost priest of Jewish religion in Jerusalem, and so the Samaritans still have a high priest. The high priest in former times was somehow elected. We don't know exactly how. In our days, and at least going back to the Middle Ages, the high priest is simply elected by God, as the Samaritans would claim. Simply the oldest member of the priestly family becomes the high priest, and the Samaritans explain that as election by God. So usually the tenure of a high priest is rather short, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, according to the age. The Samaritans read the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses in Hebrew, but they don't have any other biblical books. So they don't have the prophets, they don't have the writings. They only have the Torah. This is not special to the Samaritans. Other Jewish sects in late antiquity had just the same, focusing also on the Torah only. So this is a feature which doesn't set apart the Samaritans from other parts of Israelite religion, but it is a special feature as compared to Jews today, of course. The Samaritans live according to the precepts of the Torah. So the Torah is their canonical law, so to say. And obviously there are then in everyday life, in religious life, many similarities to Jewish religious life, as the canonical basis is virtually the same. But obviously you can understand the text in several ways, so there are differences. One difference is, for instance, that in Jewish religion, you generally circumcise your boy at the 8th day, but if the son is ill, or if there is any health problem, or the father is not present, you can do it on the 9th day, on the 10th day, on another day. in the Samaritan religion, you have to do it according to the precept of the Torah at the 8th day. So and this became, of course, in the Middle Ages, this became a huge topic of discussion between Jews and Samaritans. So life according to the precepts of the Torah still means something else in many details of daily life. The Samaritans pray in Hebrew and in Aramaic. Having said that, Israelis today or learned Jews wouldn't understand the Hebrew dialect by the Samaritans. And the same is the case with regard to Aramaic. So the Samaritans have a very unique type of Aramaic dialect, and Samaritan Hebrew is very different as well. It's also different in terms of script. The Samaritans use a script which is today generally designated as Samaritan script, but it is the old Hebrew script which the Samaritans continue to use, while in Jewish religion there was a shift from the Hebrew script to the Aramaic script. So what we call today Hebrew script is, in terms of the history of the script, Aramaic script, while the Samaritans continue the tradition of the Hebrew script. And then the Samaritans, as the Jews, have one sanctuary, one central sanctuary, as again prescribed in the Torah, of course. But the sanctuary is not in Jerusalem for them. It's on Mount Gerizim, which is a high mountain just to the south of Nablus, which is ancient Shechem or Sikhem, according to whatever Bible translation you use. Jerusalem, as you may know, is not mentioned in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. Mount Gerizim is, so in some terms the Samaritans are here on the better side as regarding the foundation of their religion. And of course this becomes a huge topic of discussion between the two sects. So if Jews and Samaritans have so much in common, how does it come that we read in John 4, which is a text from the 1st century CE, a story like that? You may know it. Jesus comes to Samaria, to Sychar, which is actually Nablus, Shechem, and he meets there a Samaritan woman, wants to get some drink, and she brings out the water from the well, and she says to him, "But you are Jewish. You can't drink from our water." Why not? It's not told here in the story, because the concept of ritual purity in Judaism and in Samaritanism is totally different. So any Samaritan woman, any Samaritan at all, is from a Jewish perspective ritually impure. And the same is true also in the opposite direction. So a Jew cannot accept a drink from a Samaritan, and a Samaritan cannot accept a drink from a Jew. Obviously, that means that in the 1st century, whether this story is historically true or not, it expresses some historical truth, of course. In the 1st century CE, in spite of all the common things between Jews and Samaritans, the two sects couldn't live anymore together. They couldn't go to the same souk, to the same market. They couldn't use the same wells, and so on. So how did that happen? I will come back to that. Today, the Samaritans live in two communities. One in Nablus, Hebrew is Shechem, and one in Holon, a suburb of Tel Aviv. Nablus is, of course, their historical center. Holon is a neighborhood which emerged only in the 1950s with the help of the then Israeli President Ben Zvi, who was a historian and helped minorities, tried to help minorities. With his help, the Samaritans were able to buy an area in Holon, before that, they weren't able to move even out of Shechem because they were not allowed to buy any land except of what they already owned until the end of World War I. So a few historical data, and again, how this shift from a common religion, Israelite religion, to two sects. There were actually more, but these two survived. How did that happen? And it happened all basically in the 2nd century BCE, when the Maccabees and then John Hyrcan as one of their descendants became high priest and king-like figure in Jerusalem. And he was very focused on Jerusalem and the Judean region and tried to Judaize all the regions in the surroundings. And he did the same with the Samaritans. And while it obviously was acceptable that in spite of the precept to have only one sanctuary, is in fact having two, namely the one in Jerusalem and the one on Mount Gerizim, it wasn't anymore for John Hyrcan, and he came with his army and destroyed the Samaritan sanctuary, which at that time was an Israelite sanctuary, not yet a Samaritan sanctuary, on Mount Gerizim, and tried to turn the Samaritans into Jews in his concept of Judaism, and the Samaritans refused. So the Samaritans from that time onward became their own independent sect. They became Samaritans, from Israelites to Samaritans, as at the same times the Israelites in the south became Jews in the term as we use it today. The Samaritan diaspora in late antiquity was about the same as the Jewish. It was huge, it was many congregations, but unlike the Jews, the Samaritan diaspora remained largely in the eastern Mediterranean, up to Greece, and maybe even Sicily, but not further. And the main congregations were in the big cities of the southeastern Mediterranean, so in Cairo, in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Sarafand, in the Lebanon, in Gaza, and so on. However, the Samaritans had a very unfortunate fate for several reasons, and they became smaller and smaller, fewer and fewer congregations. And in the 17th century, it were so few that all of them moved to Nablus, where an old community had continued to live. And that community in Nablus was from that time onward the only one which survived. But also this community became smaller and smaller, and by the early 20th century, just before World War I, only 140 Samaritans left. So basically, the British coming to Nablus saved the community. Because then they were able to buy land, they were able to go to hospital, they became financial means, they could do businesses and so on. And in 1918, the first Samaritans moved to Jaffa, which was in terms of business a much better place than Nablus at that time. And that second center started to emerge, which then became shifted another time from Jaffa to Cholon in the 1950s. From 1949, however, until 1967, a split between these two communities happened with the Jordan occupation of West Bank. And the Samaritans were not able to move between the two congregations, which was a problem for them, because you have to do pilgrimage 3 times a year to Mount Gerizim. And of course, the Israeli Samaritans who go to army, to Israeli army, and live an Israeli life, speak Hebrew, they were not allowed to do pilgrimage, or most of them were not allowed to do pilgrimage to Mount Gerizim. So in terms of that, it was a problem. In other terms, it was almost a blessing for the community because there were no priests in Cholon because the priestly families had stayed in Nablus. So with the emergence of that community in Cholon, a new type of lay leadership emerged within the congregation, very learned Samaritans who spoke up against the priests, the priestly elites, and had their own opinions in terms of religion, in terms of everyday life, in terms of modernization of religious life, and so on. And this proved to be very successful, also in terms of economic development, of course. Since 1967, the Samaritans move freely. It's very interesting in terms of citizenship and identity today because the Samaritans in Nablus, they live like Palestinians. They speak Palestinian Arabic, the dialect of Nablus, so they go to school in Nablus. Many of them work in Nablus and in Ramallah and beyond. But at the same time, and they have a Palestinian ID and a Jordanian passport. At the same time, most of them also have Israeli citizenship and move freely to Israel. Many of the younger generations, they commute to Tel Aviv from Nablus, which is for most of the Palestinians unthinkable. So they live really a life between Israel and Palestinians, which sometimes goes better and sometimes is also for worse, because sometimes, and it's going to be worse if they are identified with Jews in Nablus. So since 1988, the last date here, this was one of those not so good times because this was the beginning of the first Intifada, and the Samaritans lived in the old city, in the old city center of Nablus, and that was a problem with the first Intifada. So the families started to move up on Mount Gerizim and started to erect there a new village, which is called Kiryat Luza, and nowadays a few Samaritans still have their houses in Nablus in the city below, but most of them in Cholon now every day live in that village, in that Samaritan village called Kiryat Luza, which is just beneath the peak of Mount Gerizim. So here you have a picture taken from the east. In between that shoulder you see the city of Nablus. So it's a very beautiful geographical location. On the right-hand side, Mount Ebal. On the left-hand side, to the south, Mount Gerizim. And Mount Gerizim is not a single peak, but it's rather a high plateau with several peaks, as you will see. And this is also historically a very important place because here you have Tel Balata, which is actually the ancient city of Shechem, one of the main cities in biblical times of that whole region. About, if we go back 2,000 years and want to understand how the city worked, we have that coin. And that coin is very interesting because it's actually like a panorama picture of Nablus. You have the Cardo here with the two gates. You have a stairway leading up Mount Gerizim to a sanctuary. And you have a driveway, or walking way at that time probably. Today it's a driveway, leading up here, then a fork, one branch to that sanctuary, the other one to a second one on a second peak of Mount Gerizim. And this is actually, the green circled one is actually the Samaritan sanctuary. The ways in Nablus today are still the same. So you still have the Cardo within the city. The stairway has been excavated. The sanctuary of Zeus has been excavated. And also the Samaritan sanctuary on the further peak of Mount Gerizim has been excavated. So here you see a reconstruction, and basically just with new houses, this is the situation of Nablus today also. We are standing here on top of Tel Balata. You see Tel El Ras, which is the first peak, and you see the second peak. This is not a church, this is a palace of Nablus billionaire, but just behind that palace, Al-Masri, just behind that palace, there is the Samaritan village, and above it is the former sanctuary. So just compare this. The photo is taken from here, and you see that peak, and you see that region here. On top of Mount Gerizim, on that Samaritan peak, there have been excavations. This is a church, a Greek church. So in Greek times, in late antique Greek times, this was a Hellenistic city with a huge church. But the church stood on top of what used to be the Samaritan sanctuary. Obviously, the excavators didn't want to destroy the church in order to go deeper, but they did excavate the stairway leading to the altar of the Samaritans. This stairway and the plateau just on top is from Persian times, so 6th, 5th century BCE. So we know that the Samaritan sanctuary at least dates back to the 6th, 5th century, and there is good reason to believe that it goes even further back, as there have been found remnants from the Iron Age from the 8th, 9th century. This house there is a mosque, so you see there is a continuation of several holy places. Okay. On top of that hill plateau, the Samaritans locate basically all their holy geography. One of it is the Mizbeach Yitzchak, the Isaac's altar, the altar on which Abraham, according to the Bible, Genesis 22, was supposed to slaughter Isaac. So in the Samaritan tradition, that's how it looks like. And if you walk around on that plateau, you will see Beit El, the house of God, and the ancient site of the main altar, and so on. So basically, all the holy geography of the Samaritans is situated on that plateau. And the Samaritans, during their pilgrimages, they go from place to place. So that's the Jerusalem of the Samaritans, so to say. As regards the Samaritan Torah, it looks pretty much like a Sephardic Torah scroll. It has a clothing, it's a scroll, but as opposed to the Jewish Torah in the synagogue, the Samaritans will not read from the scroll, but they read from codices. So the scroll has only symbolic functions. And during prayer service, they put it on a chair like that, and then they read from their codices. So what is the Samaritan Torah? The Samaritan Torah is the text of the Pentateuch as handed down among the Samaritans. This is not trivial. As I said, it's in a different dialect, it's in a different pronunciation, and it has some variants as well in the text, to which I will come back later. Here again, one of those pictures, and you see again the symbolical function of the scroll. Yeah? They never read from that scroll. They take it as a symbol. They read from their books. The oldest known dated manuscripts of the Samaritan Torah, which are preserved, were copied in the 11th century CE and preserve a unique Hebrew scribal tradition. So 11th century is obviously much later than the Torah emerged. I said the split happened in the 2nd century BCE, and from that time is the textual tradition. But the oldest full textual witnesses come from the 11th century. This is not so different from the Jewish Hebrew text, because the oldest full manuscripts come only from the 10th century also. And generally in the Hebrew tradition, there is almost a black hole of Hebrew manuscripts between Qumran, which is 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, until the 8th, 9th century. So exactly in the time when most of the Hebrew texts were written, Talmud and so on, we almost have no manuscripts. Strangely enough, the same situation is true to the Samaritans. It's not true for Greek literature. It's not true for Syriac literature, but it is true for both branches of Hebrew literature. So this is one of the oldest Torah manuscripts of the Samaritans. Those of you who know a bit Hebrew script, Jewish Hebrew script, will immediately see it's a different script. Still, you will recognize some letters, I guess. So the Aleph here is very similar. But what I would like to focus on here is the manuscript tradition and its uniqueness, which you see even in modern manuscripts the same way. So Samaritan manuscripts are usually framed. You see, the first letter is moved apart and a frame-like structure is produced in order to provide the page like a holy character. You do that not with a regular letter, you do it with a Torah scroll, this framing. And that's a feature you wouldn't find in other Hebrew traditions, but you find it in the Samaritan tradition. Another feature which you see very well here, the Samaritan manuscripts have like empty holes where there isn't something written. You would never see such a thing in a Jewish manuscript, because in the Jewish manuscript tradition there is a horror vacui, a fear to leave empty spaces. So you broaden the letters in order to fill up the spaces. The Samaritans don't have that fear, and they like to have these holes because it means that you can produce list-like structures. You can put the same letters one with the other, and so. And you can produce these frames. And you can also inscribe your own name in a manuscript, as this scribe did. This is the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, and the scribe simply moved 2 columns of the text apart. So I mean, it's one text, but he produced out of the one text block 2 columns, and then he moved single letters in that empty vertical line, and he wrote there, Ana Abi Berakata, I Abi Berakata, cut is there. So, I wrote this holy Torah, and it is my 27th Torah, and I wrote it for this and that person, and may he and his family live a long life, and so on and so on. And it stretches over 20 pages, 25 pages in that codex. So you inscribe your own name and the name of your client into that Torah scroll. Again, a feature which would be unthinkable in a Jewish Hebrew manuscript tradition. Another feature is Samaritans, of course, don't have images, but due to their tradition that they can like move letters on pages and words on pages, they can create images with the help of the text. This is an image of Numbers 34 in one of the manuscripts of the Torah. And Numbers 34 is a chapter which tells about the geographical partition of the Holy Land. So this is a picture of the Holy Land, because it goes according to the 4 points of the compass: north, east, south, west. And in the middle, this is of course the center, the holy center, Mount Gerizim. So this is Mount Gerizim in the center of the Holy Land. And you have more images like that. So the text of the Samaritan Torah represents a Pentateuch text which was current in the 2nd century BCE among followers of both the Jerusalem and the Mount Gerizim sanctuaries. This text displays a harmonizing tendency. How do we know that this text was known in the south and in the north? We know it from Qumran, because in Qumran, manuscripts which virtually have the same text as the text of the Samaritan Torah have been found, besides manuscripts which have virtually the same text as the Jewish Torah. So at that time, this text was one of the textual options of the Torah which were current. So an example of a Samaritan reading, it's not a Samaritan reading, it's also in the Samaritan text, but it's also in the Greek translation of the Torah. Genesis 2:2. On the 6th or on the 7th day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So there is a variant. Did he finish on the 6th day or on the 7th day? In the Jewish text, it's on the 7th day. But this may seem somehow illogical, because he ceased on the 7th day from all the work that he did. So how could he finish the work on the 7th day? That consideration led some scribes to changing 7th to 6th day. So then he finished the work on the 6th day, and he held a Shabbat, ceased to work on the 7th day. So this is not specifically Samaritan, as I said. These are all variants which were known in Judaism in general. But there is still the question: did the Samaritans try to correct the text towards their own views? And in fact, this doesn't seem to be so much the case, although the Samaritan Torah is in some points very much to the point of the Samaritan religion. Famous case is Deuteronomy 27, which is a precept spoken by Moses to Israel. So when you have crossed over the Jordan, the next day they will cross over the Jordan in the book of Joshua, you shall set up these stones about which I am commanding you today on Mount Gerizim, says the Samaritan Torah, or on Mount Ebal, says the Jewish Torah, and you shall cover them with plaster, and you shall build an altar, and so on. So this is the first altar that the Israelites should erect after they cross the Jordan, the first altar to be built in the Holy Land. According to the Samaritan Torah, it's on Mount Gerizim. According to the Jewish Torah, it's on Mount Ebal. What is the problem? The problem is that in the next chapter, Mount Ebal is the mountain of cursing, whereas Mount Gerizim is the mountain of blessing. So if the altar is on the cursed mountain, it is a transitional altar, obviously. If it is on the mountain of blessing, this is already the altar. So, however, and for a long time it was argued, so the Samaritans changed Mount Ebal into Mount Gerizim in order to suit their own views. However, we have now manuscripts which make it obvious that it seems to have been just the opposite. So the original text of the book of Deuteronomy had Mount Gerizim, and it was then changed to Mount Ebal, obviously in a polemic attempt to weaken the basis of Samaritan thinking. I will skip over that. Samaritan Hebrew. Is someone among you who knows Hebrew? So if not, I will not play you that thing, but those who want, I can share you with, you can send me an email, and I can send you the recording, because the fun is the difference from general Hebrew, from Jewish Hebrew. So if you want to hear it, just send me an email. we are just approaching Passover and Easter, and the Samaritans obviously do Passover as well, but they still celebrated with an offering. Why an offering? You see, the offerings in Jerusalem were seized because the sanctuary was destroyed. No offerings, since there is no sanctuary. Sanctuary on Mount Gerizim is destroyed, so no offerings. And right, the Samaritans do not do any offerings except Passover sacrifice. And the reason for that is that the Passover sacrifice is the only sacrifice which, according to the narrative of the Torah, was not commanded in connection with the legislation on Mount Sinai, which is the legislation of the sanctuary, but it was already commanded in Egypt with the exodus from Egypt, and it was not commanded to the priesthood because the priesthood was only installed on Mount Sinai. It was commanded to the people. So this is an offering of the people of all Israel, and it is it's not connected to the sanctuary. So you can do it basically on every place. The Samaritans do it just in their village close to Mount Gerizim, but it's not an offering of the sanctuary itself, which is why the Samaritans still do it. And in fact, in late antiquity, some Jewish groups were following just the same view. So in some Jewish groups, even after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the offering of Passover went on, although all the other offerings ceased to exist when the temple was destroyed. So when you go to this is the only surviving Israelite offering, and you can go there, see it, and you can look at the pictures here. There is pits 2 meters deep. I don't know how many feet that is. Thank you. So during the day, these pits are, which are covered with plaster, are warmed up. Really, really hot, very frightening. It must be a nightmare to come close to that pits. Here in that scene, the Samaritan families, when late afternoon approaches, they bring their sheep. So according to the Torah, every family should offer a sheep. But if your family is too small, you can join another family because you shouldn't waste anything from the animal. That would be improper. So small families share a sheep, big families might have 2. As Samer said, the Samaritans today are about 800, so currently an average Passover offering is like 55 sheep. We are already in the liturgy, the Samaritans standing there, the Samaritan men with their sheep. Here you see the poor guys. And they pray. This is the prayer gesture of the Samaritans. Still the liturgy, you see, it's today it's a bit stadium-like because many tourists come and want to see it, and the Samaritans had to accommodate them, so they built these stadium-like structures. Here is the Samaritan high priest who leads the ceremony. Still praying. And then the part in the Torah is read where the offering is described. And in the moment when the text says, "and you shall slaughter it," exactly in that moment, 55 knives slaughter 55 sheep. And it's very bloody, of course. And it's a problem because you can't waste the blood. So you must burn the blood, you must burn everything of the offering. Nothing of the offering can stay overnight. So they catch the blood with all kinds of fabric and so on, and then they burn this fabric. of course, it's you need experience to properly slaughter. And then, as written in the Torah, you should mark your firstborn son with blood. That's what is done here. Actually, you see, this is a blonde kid. This is the kid of an Ukrainian woman who married a Samaritan, which is another interesting story about the Samaritans. So this is an important part, because in the Torah is written you shouldn't eat the hip sinew of an animal. And here a priest, who is an expert in this, takes out this hip sinew, which can't be eaten according to the Torah, which is then burned. So you see the poles, the sheep then come on poles. Here the sheep is already on a pole. The priest inspects everything, because of course it must be a faultless animal. And if any fault is found, the sheep will be burned and a new substitute sheep will be slaughtered. So there are always like 5 substitute sheep. So you see the inspection. This is the inspection of the inner parts. It's a young priest, which are taken out, washed, salted, and then put back into the belly. You see, it's very carefully inspected. This is again an interesting part, because according to the Torah, the priest gets the right foreleg of each slaughtered animal. So there are the priestly families and there are the non-priestly families. And from every sheep which is slaughtered by a non-priestly family, the right foreleg is cut off and given to the priests. And then you have the priestly poles where you have like 20 right forelegs in addition to the sheep. You see it here. It's only 3 in that case, but yeah, this is called the altar, where all the parts which are not eaten are burned, and they have to be burned totally until the next morning. Here are the poles ready. And then the moment where the pits will be filled approaches. And that's a very busy moment, because you have to be very, very quick. You have to put the poles into the pit. You cover the pit in order to extinct the fire, because otherwise the sheep will totally burn. And you cover it with mud then, with a blanket and mud. You see here. They're very nervous, because it can only take a few seconds. Otherwise, the wood will burn immediately. And you see here the poles poking out of the pit. And then it takes like 2 hours. After 2 hours, the sheep will be taken out and will be eaten in a hurry, as the Torah says, in the houses. But for that celebration, only Samaritan families and their circumcised guests are welcomed. So most of the tourists can't take part in that part of the ceremony. Thank you for your patience.